In this video, we'll be looking at basic techniques for assembling landscapes in Blender, with a focus on working with meshes and materials.
Hello, my friends. It's good to see you again. It's been a long time, hasn't it? You're probably wondering where I've been.
I met a girl, moved to Louisiana, and became a cat father. I freelance scanned for a few companies over the years, and last year I became a full-time scanner at Polygon.
And I'm finally figuring out how to balance my time well enough to make videos again. Oh yeah, and my plane crashed and I'm trapped on a desert island. Back to the topic of this video, landscapes. Why landscapes? Because they're fun. I'm a little out of breath.
Not only are they fun, they're a special sort of technical challenge too. It's kind of like a big model or a big collection of models. How do you make something huge that looks good both close up and from far away? And how do you make it simple to work with while still retaining as much control over its appearance as possible? There are many ways to create landscapes, and after years of trying out different techniques, I've settled into my preferred workflow. I generate individual landform meshes and textures ahead of time, which allows me to separate a lot of the technical work from the creative side of things. Here's why I like this approach. Reason number 1: simplicity. I want the process of creating my landscape to be as simple as possible. For example, I use mesh models instead of displaced planes, so I can see results immediately in the viewport without extra setup. It's just drag and drop. Reason 2: versatility. Meshes are compatible with virtually anything in Blender, and they're very predictable. A mesh works with everything from modifiers and constraints to vertex groups, particles, and weight painting. Relating to this is reason number 3, stability. A mesh-based landform is stable. For example, you don't have to worry about Blender updating and suddenly your geometry node's landform doesn't work anymore. And the final reason is number 4, control. I want the ability to make my landscape look however I want. So even though I want to keep things simple, I still want artistic freedom without being boxed in by technical restrictions. This approach ultimately allows me to focus more on creativity than technical tasks, so I'm not flip-flopping between different parts of my brain so much when I'm working on my scene. I prep landforms in advance, so I can jump right into arranging my scene elements instead of having to build every landform from scratch each time I start a new scene. It's like kit bashing, but for landscapes. Land bashing. This method is simple, fast, and reliable. And much of what I talk about in this video has gone into the design of a new terrain library I've created, Foundations of the Earth. I've spent a shitload of time working on this over the past 2 years. If you're interested, you can find it on the Blender market. And for those of you who are interested but extraordinarily frugal, there's a free sample version available with a few assets which you can download and follow along with.
I'm not here to say any particular method is right or wrong, or my way is the right way to do it. If you like using the Ant Terrain add-on, you keep right on using it. And the same goes for any other tool or technique out there. I'm simply here to share what I found that works best for me, and maybe it'll work for you too.
This video is broken down into 5 chapters. Planning, creating landforms, working with meshes, working with materials, and everything else. Chapter 1. Planning. Depending on how simple or complex your scene is, you may be able to skip this step altogether and just wing it. It can be fun to improvise, but if you're creating an environment you haven't made before, or a particularly complex landscape, it can be really helpful to spend even just 10 or 15 minutes gathering references of what your environment looks like in the real world. This includes large-scale features like what kinds of landforms you might see, what the weather is like, and big features like forests or wetlands. Medium-scale details like big boulders, small rivers, and trees, and small-scale details like rocks, dirt, grass, all the materials that make up your environment. Reference is valuable, but I suggest you avoid collecting too many references, because personally, I find it's easy to become overwhelmed if I have too many choices. 2 to 3 options is usually plenty. When I've got 10 options to look at, that's when I start to slow down, so keep that in mind if you experience the same thing. If you're looking for good reference images, I recommend these resources. Just remember, if you're looking for what things actually look like, stick to photographic references. But if you're just looking for something cool to inspire you, then feel free to use artistic works like renders or paintings as your reference. I'll put some links to these resources in the description below. Once you have a clear idea of what you want your landscape to look like, then you just need to gather the necessary assets. This includes not only the landforms themselves, but all the other models and textures you'll need. Here are some asset libraries I like to use. Megascans, maybe you've heard of them. Polygon, Scans Library, Materials of the World, and Polyhaven. Chapter 2, Creating Landforms. Okay, if you already have the landforms you'll be using, you can skip this chapter. If not, then it's time to make them. Let's get into it and see how the sausage is made. I said we're making landforms, but how exactly are we making them? If you're a Blender purist and you want to do everything in Blender, then feel free to do so. Personally, I find it much harder and more time-consuming to create realistic landforms directly in Blender, and the results are often still lacking. Maybe in the future this will change, but currently, it is just far too limiting when you compare Blender to a dedicated terrain generation software like Gaia or World Machine or World Creator. The 3 biggest advantages these programs bring you are speed, realism, and texturing options. Speed, because they're optimized for the type of processing required. Realism, because you have way more options for the types of terrains you can generate and the details you can add. And texturing options, meaning, of course, the types of texture maps you can generate for your landforms. And I'm not just talking about generating color and normal maps, but masks too. And masks are really the secret sauce when it comes to creating believable landscapes. Masks deal with special features of each landform, things like erosion and soil and rock. These masks are necessary because landscapes are huge. Even if you had a texture 1,000,000 pixels across, it'll look good from a distance, but as soon as you start getting close to it, it's going to get blurry. You cannot rely on a single color map for an entire landform, and even if the resolution was infinite, you'd still be stuck with the look of whatever that map is. You can't easily change it to look like a different environment. And that's why masks are important. You can tile seamless textures to get as much detail as you need, and you can use masks to blend those textures together to create a unified, cohesive material. This technique was first explained to me years ago by landscape artist Hussein Shalan. He wrote a detailed breakdown of a desert environment he created using this method, which you can find on his ArtStation. In his example, he uses Quixel Mixer, but the principles remain the same in Blender. So, we know we need both the landform geometry itself, and just as importantly, we need terrain masks for the landform. There's no right or wrong about which terrain masks you should generate, but I tend to prefer having as many options as possible. Now, the software you're using will dictate how exactly you make this. I only use Gaia, so I can't speak too much on the other options out there. I like Gaia because it's simple to use and I can see exactly what result I'm getting in the viewport. Showing how to use Gaia would require a much longer video of its own, but if you want to learn, I recommend watching videos from these 2 YouTube channels, Cosmonaut and Dylan. Just remember, you're not simply exporting a height map of your terrain, you're also exporting a mesh and texture maps. I also bake out a normal map. If you want, you can export a LOD chain from Gaia too, but it's not necessary. I'm breezing through this section to save time, but you really have about 1,000,000 options for what you can do in Gaia, so just be aware that you can create a lot more than what I'm showing in this video. After you've exported all your assets files, import the mesh into Blender and start adding in all the texture maps. Don't forget to scale your landform up to the correct size. I'll go into the specifics of how I set up the materials a little later in this video. Now, repeat these steps for every landform you create. Chapter 3, Working with Meshes.
Okay, you've got your landform set up in Blender, and they're ready to go. Before we move on to materials, let's focus on meshes. I'm going to add one of my mountains from the pack. If you don't see the landform in the viewport when you add it, go to your viewport clipping distance and increase the number. I usually set it to 4000 when I'm starting. You can save this number in your default Blender scene, by the way. Now, because your landforms are polygon meshes, they're simple to use and simple to edit. And within Blender, we have a lot of different ways to edit them. You can edit the mesh directly, of course, but most of the time I'll use modifiers instead. For example, let's say you want to change the shape of a mountain. There's a lot of ways to do that. How about we use a lattice? Add the lattice, scale it up to match the size of the landform, add the lattice modifier to the landform, and reference the lattice. Now, when you select the lattice and tab into edit mode, you'll see you can distort the shape of your landform quite easily. This is much faster than going into edit mode and adjusting the mesh directly. Add more resolution to your lattice to have more control over the shape, but try not to add more resolution than necessary. Lattices may seem simple, but they are deceptively powerful. Much more than simply raising or lowering the points of the lattice, you can also scale them, shear them sideways, rotate them, and you can enable proportional editing to control the falloff of these adjustments. This is helpful for raising or lowering large portions of the terrain. Experiment with different combinations of these basic tools to achieve different effects. You can also use lattices to create variations of duplicated meshes to make their repetition less obvious. Here I've duplicated the same landform 3 times and used different lattice adjustments for each copy. And you can use Alt-D instead of Shift-D to create instanced versions of objects, which requires less memory for your scene. You might also want to parent your lattice to your landform to make it simpler to move things around. Another tip is using lattices in conjunction with shrink wrap. Let's take something like this flat landform. Overall, it's pretty flat, but it's still got high and low areas. If we were to just use a shrink wrap modifier on the landform itself, it's going to completely flatten out all those smaller details. So instead, add a lattice and apply the shrink wrap modifier to the lattice instead of to the landform, and then apply the lattice modifier to the landform. Now, any changes made to the object, which is driving the shrink wrapping of the lattice, will influence the overall shape of the landform, without destroying its forms and details. Simple, right? This is a nice way to add rolling hills into what would otherwise be a fairly flat landform. It's 5 AM, can you tell? How about if you're working with a canyon or slope wall? You might have nice detail for a close-up, but it's not very long. What do we do if we want to extend it? Here's what I've been doing. Add your landform, don't scale it, and add an empty. Align the empty with one of the corners of your landform. Parent the empty to the landform once you have it in place. Now add a mirror modifier to the landform, set the empty as the object to mirror around, and ensure the correct axis is selected for the mirroring direction. Increase the merge distance as well, since landforms are big. Now, if that's long enough, great, but if not, you can add an array modifier to the landform and make it however long you need it to be. And remember to check the merge option on the array modifier to weld adjacent vertices together. You can add a curve to control the shape of your newly extended landform, and of course you can use a lattice to further influence the shape and break up repetition. You can even apply a curve modifier to your lattice to force it to follow your landform. You may just want to disable the curve on the landform itself, otherwise the curve transformation will essentially be doubled. This is a really fast and simple way to introduce some variety into the duplicated geometry in order to break up the repetition and make that long array look more natural. And finally, the last modifier I'll mention is the good old Boolean, because sometimes you just want to chop something off. Add some simple geometry, slap this bad boy on there, and boom, you're done. I recommend setting the Boolean option to fast instead of exact. And as always, you can parent it to the landform to make it easier to move everything around. There are so many other options you have to choose from. You can use shape keys with lattices, vertex groups in conjunction with shrink wrap and lattices, control multiple landforms with a single lattice,
And of course, there's all the other modifiers. And if you want to switch out one LOD for another, you can use the Copy Attributes menu add-on to copy the location, rotation, and scale data of one and copy it to the other. As you can see, there are a lot of options when it comes to manipulating the geometry of your landform meshes. We'll take a look at materials next, but first, a word from the sponsor of this video, this coconut.
I did it. I'm on the mountain. I'm here on the mountain. Ew, ew.
Chapter 4, Working with Materials.
When it comes to materials, we have even more options to control our landscape's appearance. But before we get into the fun creative stuff, there's the boring technical side to ensure everything works properly. Oh my god.
This is how I set up my landform materials. Depending on your own preferences, you may choose to set things up differently or use fewer maps. All the texture maps are placed to the left and organized into 4 frames. Color. You may have only one color map for your asset. For Foundations of the Earth, each asset has 6 color maps. Normals. This is the tangent space normal map that gives the landform extra detail. Height. This is a 32-bit EXR height map of the landform, in case you prefer to displace a plane instead of using the model itself. Masks. This is the largest frame containing a variety of black and white textures used for masking purposes. To the right of the texture maps is a custom node group. This is where all the magic happens. We'll talk about this in a moment. To the right of that are some additional nodes for adjusting colors and values, and all of this plugs into the shader and material output. You'll notice that all the textures in the masks frame are muted. This is done to reduce the amount of memory needed to render the scene. Remember that every texture that exists in your nodes, even if it's not contributing to the final material, will take up memory and slow down your renders. Unless it's muted. If you want to use a texture which is muted, you just need to unmute it. To mute or unmute a node, select it and hit M on the keyboard. You can do this for multiple nodes at once. For now, I'm going to unmute all of them. So that's how I like to set up each material. All the landform's default texture maps are on the left, the custom node group is in the middle, and then I have a few extra nodes on the right. Every other landform in your scene can use the same shared node group in the middle. The idea is that the shared node group will be responsible for the overall look of your landforms, no matter how many you add to the scene. Whereas the nodes outside of that, over here on the right, are there if you want to adjust the look of an individual landform. Obviously, you can change the nodes around and use different ones, but everything outside of the shared node group will only be applied to that specific landform, and everything inside the shared node group will, of course, be applied to every other landform that contains that same node group. This allows you to automatically update every landform in your scene instantly. So, let's jump in there. Select the node group and hit Tab to enter it. And here we are. It's pretty simple in here now, but trust me, it doesn't take long to turn this into a nightmare. For the group inputs, we've got all the image maps we created, plus a couple custom color inputs at the top. I'll talk more about those later. And for the group outputs, we've got some pretty standard PBR options. It may not look like much, but right now we're in a box bristling with infinite possibilities. Before we start adding anything, let's look at what's already here. Right now, I've got color map 1 hooked up to the color output. To try out the other maps, simply connect the noodles. These 2 nodes can be ignored, by the way, I just add them for my own convenience. If you want to preview any of your maps, just hook them up to the color output or use the Node Wrangler add-on. This is especially handy for the masking textures, since it's easy to forget what each type looks like, and the same mask type can vary a lot between different landforms. Basic masking. Now, here's a simple example of how to blend textures. I'll take a color mix node and connect one of the color maps to the first input, and I'll leave the second color alone. I'll connect the flow primary mask into the factor input, and now our landform suddenly looks like it's got areas where material cascades or flows down the surface. You can change the color, you can also adjust the strength of the mask to make the blending harder or softer, or to invert the blend. You can even blur the masks if you prefer to do that. And of course, you can use a texture instead of a solid color as your second input. In a nutshell, all your landscape texturing can be this simple, using a mask to blend between two different inputs to create a more layered and believable result. You may have noticed these bottom two slots, Texture A and Texture B. These are a little different from the masks above. In Gaia, they're simply referred to as texture. They're not really masks so much as they're a type of recoloring texture. So while they are black and white images themselves, you can use a color ramp to remap the grayscale values to something else entirely. I like to include two versions with each asset for extra variety. Here's an example. I'll open this image that I like the colors of, and now I'll add a color ramp. The next step is to specify the colors that I want to use. Instead of manually selecting each color point, I'm going to click on this arrow here and choose eyedropper. Now I'll just click and drag over the colors that I want to include. When I release the mouse button, it will stop selecting colors and apply them to the ramp. You can flip the color ramp or change the distribution of the colors. You can also place another node in front of the color ramp to alter the color wrapping. I like using the curves node for this. It really doesn't take much of a change to get a drastically different result. Even small changes to the initial curve can result in huge differences over the entire landform, as you can see here. Usually, the more complex your curve becomes, the more detailed the result will be, but this still depends heavily on the colors in your color ramp. And don't forget, there is still the second Texture B option to work with, if you need added variety. And of course, you can adjust the colors after the color ramp to tweak the result. And remember, you don't have to just use photos of landscapes. In fact, just as often, I'll use an image of wood or stone or a delicious $5 footlong. Advanced masking. Texture maps aren't your only option for controlling how your textures are blended together. There are also a number of custom node groups I like to use to give me more blending options. These are included with my landform pack as well. Let's look at them now. Slopes node. This is one I use quite often. Simply put, it adjusts intensity based on how steep the surface is. When we connect it up to our color mix node, you can see that the flat areas are green and steep areas are red. I like to use a color ramp with this node to adjust the transition between vertical and horizontal. By the way, if you find yourself using a node a lot, it can be helpful to add it to your Quick Favorites menu. Simply right-click on the node in the menu and select Add to Quick Favorites. Now when you press Q, the node is right there to add. I've added a few additional options to this node to add more randomness to it. Z-axis node. The Z-axis node is similar to the slope node, but it's based on height instead of surface angle. This is useful if you want to adjust your material based on height, such as snow on top of a mountain. You can use a color ramp to control the masking with this node as well. Keep in mind that you can always add more points to your color ramp to achieve more complex materials. With this node as well, I've added some additional settings. Camera distance node. The camera distance node allows you to blend materials based on the distance from the camera. It's actually really simple on the inside. Just type the distance in meters from the camera where you want the blend to occur and add, that's right, a color ramp. My main reason for adding this node was so that you could control the specular values of PBR materials so that they look correct both up close and from a distance. But I'm sure you'll find other uses for it too. Basic texturing. Now let's talk about adding textures. Like I said earlier, when it comes to landscapes, unless you're using a procedural texture, you're going to have to tile your textures if you don't want your landscape to turn into a pixelated, blurry mess when you start to get close to it. Before we get into anything fancy, let's look at some basic texture projection options. Option 1, Standard Flat Projection. This is pretty much your default projection in Blender. It projects your texture straight onto the mesh faces in a grid formation. Flat projection is enabled when an image texture node is set to flat. You might use generated or UV texture coordinates, but I actually prefer to use object texture coordinates for landscapes, and here's why. I'll add a checkerboard texture for this example. If you use generated or UV texture coordinates, you won't have seamless mapping of different objects. The texture isn't going to change when you move a landform around, or rotate it, or scale it up and down, right? And you wouldn't expect it to. But When we're moving multiple landforms around and we want them to blend into one another, and we want to ensure the surface looks the same regardless of scale, we need our texture mapping to update automatically, and that's where object texture coordinates come in handy. So I'm going to add an empty and rename it. Now I'm going to ensure I'm using object texture coordinates in my nodes, and I'll set that empty as the object that's referenced. And now I'll scale up the texture to make it clear what's happening. I can adjust the scale of my textures here in the mapping node, but I can also do it right here with the empty. But that's not even the best thing. Watch this. I'm going to add another landform here and scale it up, and make sure it's using the same shared node group. Now look what happens when I move the mountain around. The texture updates automatically, and we don't have any obvious intersection between these two landforms' textures. And you can add as many landforms as you want here. They will still adjust their texture mapping automatically, regardless of how you move, rotate, or scale them. Option 2, box projection, also called triplanar mapping. Is that a triplanar? Sound like a dork. This is great when you need to quickly project textures on the sides of a landform, not just from above. For instance, if you have vertical surfaces like cliff walls or steep slopes, and you want to texture those with a rocky cliff texture, using box projection instead of flat projection will give you a more natural looking result without stretching the texture to hell. And using object texture coordinates is still compatible with this. You can use the blend slider to soften this transition, just don't overdo it or it'll look like a blurry, mushy mess where the edges meet. I tend to use box projection mapping for texturing vertical surfaces and flat projection for more horizontal surfaces. Option 3, texture bombing. This technique sometimes goes by other names such as splat mapping, but the basic premise is the same. Project the texture randomly all over the surface to break up the repetition. This can work really well, but how well it works is going to depend on what you're trying to do. Some methods work better than others. If you want to give it a shot, I recommend checking out Arundel's tutorial here and Jonathan Lampel's tutorial here. And they both have versions you can download too. Arundel's is on his Gumroad page, and Jonathan's is on his Blender Market page. With these three basic projection options and the masking tools, you have what I consider the essential principles of how textures get applied to your landforms. Now let's talk more about the textures themselves. Advanced texturing. When it comes to textures, both raster and procedural textures can be utilized, and I often use them together to take advantage of the strengths they both offer. In this video, I'll be focusing on raster textures, but if you're interested in playing around with procedural textures, I highly recommend checking out Supernoise from Gleb Alexandrov. It's a simple but highly adaptable procedural texture that you can download for free. You can learn more about it on the Creative Shrimp YouTube channel. Map Mixer node. When you're blending together multiple textures in one material, it's nice to have more control than the standard Blender nodes give you. So I made this simple PBR map mixing node. To demonstrate the Map Mixer node, I've hooked up two sets of PBR maps. One is a rocky ground, and the other is a dirt ground. If you're using them at the same scale, they can share the same texture coordinate node. Doing this helps reduce redundant nodes in your material, which makes it less of an unrecognizable clusterfuck when you open up your blend file the next day. To control the blending, I'm using a simple noise texture. And to have some fun, I've enabled displacement. Adaptive subdivision is disabled for the viewport to keep everything running smoothly, but when I render the image, you can see there's loads of extra detail. Using a color ramp, I can change the black and white values and their position on the ramp to control the strength and fall off of the mask. And because we're using the PBR height maps as part of the mixing, we can make the blending between these two different materials look more natural. Instead of having a distinct transition between dirt and rock, we have a more natural fall off where the dirt appears to cover the crevices and lower parts of the rocks, but leaves the higher parts exposed. And you have a lot of control over how this transition occurs. For instance, I can reduce or increase the amount that the rocks jut up out of the dirt and make that transition softer or more abrupt. Instead of using a noise texture, let's try a wave texture. Now we've got lines of rock embedded in the dirt. That's kind of fun, huh? And if we need to add more textures, we can simply keep adding more map mixer nodes. But if you're going to do that, I recommend adding frames into your material to keep things organized. You'd be surprised how quickly the nodes can multiply. If you want to set this map mixer up yourself, here's what it looks like on the inside. Normal blending node. As I mentioned, each landform asset has a normal map, but if we want to use PBR materials that come with their own normal maps, we need a way to combine these multiple maps properly. Otherwise, we'll have incorrect shading results. Because Blender doesn't come with a normal map blending node, I've set this one up. Connect the normal map details that you want to add and the normal map base you want to add them to, and you will have a merged result that you can further adjust using the strength multipliers. There are 2 additional inputs that allow you to mask either of the normal maps independently. And if you have more than 2 normal maps you wish to blend, I recommend using the PBR map mixer node to mask all the normal maps from the various textures you're using, then use the final map mixer normals output as the input for the normals blending node group. Simple, right? And just a note, this can be quite a handy node for all kinds of scenes, not just landscapes. Give it a try, it can be quite fun to use. If you're keen to learn more about blending normal maps, I recommend giving these videos a watch. The last node I'll mention today is the Map Grower node. This node is intended to help break up the repetitive patterns that you get from seamless textures, to give you a result that can be used on its own or blended with other maps. To use it, enter the node group and then enter the texture node group inside that one. Choose the texture you want to use, then go back to the parent node group. You can adjust 3 scale values for big, medium, and small details, as well as the rotation for each. Use the grayscale output for black and white textures and the color output for color textures. You can adjust the intensity of the color output by adjusting the value of this color swatch here. There are a lot of different ways you can use this node, and it really excels when you need to cover a large area with a texture. If you'd like to learn more about how this node works, please check out this video on the Commerbuild YouTube channel. He does an excellent job explaining it and shares some other really handy tricks too. This is only scratching the surface of what can be done with landscape materials, but I hope I've demonstrated the potential. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention, those 2 custom color inputs at the top of the node group input. What are they for? Typically, I use these if I want to paint on top of the terrain, like when using vertex paint. For example, you could use 4 colors, red, green, blue, and black, to blend between 4 different sets of textures. This is useful if you want manual control over the blending in a specific area of your landscape, such as the ground around a house, or muddy ground near water, or bird shit under a tree. And of course, you don't have to use vertex colors to do this. It can also be done simply with an image texture, applying materials from one landform to another. So let's say you've made a landscape material that you're really happy with. The first great thing is that this can easily be applied to every other landform in your scene. Just make sure they're all using the same shared node group and have the necessary masks unmuted, and everything should update instantly. The second great thing is that you can save your work so you can reuse the same material in future projects. I recommend giving the shared node group a unique name to make it easier to identify. From then on, you can either append the node group into new Blender scenes, or mark it as an asset to use with Blender's asset browser. This helps you avoid setting up the same things over and over again, and allows you to spend more time focusing on other aspects of your environment. Chapter 5. Useful Resources.
There's a lot more that can be done to build onto your landforms and create more detailed environments.
Using geometry nodes, scattering objects, adding models, lighting, weather, and atmosphere.
But that's far too much for me to cover in a single video. I'll be making more videos to demonstrate these techniques, and of course I'll continue to develop my landscape pack as I add more content to it. In the meantime, there are loads of great tutorials and resources from artists much more skilled than myself. Here are my top recommendations for you.
Educational resources. Martin Kleckner. Martin is one of the first people that comes to mind when I think about landscapes in Blender. He's made a lot of free videos over the years covering many different aspects of landscape creation. He also has a course available on CG Boost. You can find his videos on both his personal YouTube channel as well as the CG Boost channel. Martin Nauta. Martin is another highly skilled artist and another Martin. When I first saw his tutorials, I thought, oh no, he beat me to it. But honestly, he does a much better job explaining everything than I would. If you want more in-depth details about texturing and working on landscapes in general, Martin has some great tutorials explaining his workflow and the techniques he uses. Check him out. Nodes and Noodles. I don't know their real name, but Nodes and Noodles has posted so many helpful videos about working with shaders, many of which can be directly applied to working with landscapes. I'm sure you'll learn something new and exciting if you browse their work. You can find them on YouTube as well as Twitter. I'm sorry, X. Rob Tuttle. Rob is another artist who's been creating environments in Blender for years. He has a mix of both free and paid videos focusing on environment creation, often with a mix of natural and human elements. Rob is also one of the co-founders of Polyhaven. You can find his work on his YouTube channel. Max Hay. Max has loads of great videos on his channel, many of which are well suited to working on environments. They're fun to watch, and he does a great job explaining and demonstrating his techniques. I highly recommend checking out his channel if you haven't already. Piotr Krinsky. If you want to learn how to create more complex environments, blending both natural and man-made elements, please look into Piotr's course. It's a paid tutorial, but it's well worth it in my opinion if you're looking for additional guidance. I mean, just look at this stuff. It looks great. You can find his course on both ArtStation as well as Gumroad. Tools. Instant Imposters. If you need to scatter an object along your landscape a whole bunch of times, but the actual mesh is too high poly for your system to handle, and using a billboard just won't cut it, check out Hot Dog Nugget's Imposter add-on. It might be exactly the solution you need, although keep in mind it only works with Eevee for now. You can find his add-on on both the Blender Market and Gumroad. Auto Terrainer. If you just want to quickly define a shape for part of your landscape, check out Samuel Francis's Auto Terrainer. This is handy if you want to manually model a shape for part of your terrain. You can find it available on Gumroad. Terrain Remix Brushes. Jacob Mentz uses height maps as terrain brushes in a way that I really like. His pack comes with a bunch of pre-made brushes, and you can make your own custom brushes using height maps too. Check out his videos to see it in action. You can find it on both the Blender Market and Gumroad. And the download comes with versions for both Blender and Unreal Engine, so you can use it in both if you want. Phew! I know we covered a lot of information here. This was a challenging video to write, and record, and edit. God, I hate editing. But I hope it was helpful to some of you, and gives you ideas to use in your own projects, whether they're landscapes or not. Remember, you can find the 102 landforms, plus all the custom utility node groups shown in this video in the Foundations of the Earth asset pack. And guess what? Gleb Alexandrov recently played around with the pack, and very kindly recorded a video of his own. Check it out on his channel. I'm sure you'll enjoy seeing what he came up with. And there are so many more phenomenal environment artists out there. If you're interested in improving your landscapes, I encourage you to seek out inspiration, and to experiment with your own ideas too. Who knows, maybe you'll think of something nobody's ever tried before. Somebody has to be the first one to do it. There are many things left undone in the world. Until I see you again, my friends, stay classy, and happy blending.